We're back with what's quickly becoming a very popular program. I'm pleased to welcome back to the show the Bishop Larry Gaiters. Bishop, how are you today? Welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much, Jason. It's an honor to be back on your show, and we're looking forward to really unpacking concerning this deep state and their connections to EUGENICS. I'm really excited and looking forward to it.
Absolutely. And Bishop, I think that you've been an excellent addition to the lineup of regular guests that we have here on Crowdsource the Truth. I've been getting so many emails from people who have never heard about the boule, who knew really nothing about eugenics and some of the topics you've been bringing to our attention. I want to let everybody know that they can support the Bishop and the global spiritual revolution by going to paypal.me/GSRR Media Group, GSRR Media Group. And people can support the show on Crowdsource the Truth by going to patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. And you know, Bishop, it's the beginning of the month, so it's a good time for people to become sponsors if they aren't yet. We've got a lot of new material that we're going to go over today, including some of that really bizarre imagery we were speaking about last week down at the courthouse. But I know you've prepared a tremendous amount of material for us. Where would you like to begin today, Bishop?
Yes, sir. Part two, as we unpack this deep state financial and political eugenics part two, and we're going to be touching on Wall Street. I'm going to go over it for the next 3 to 5 minutes, just in case some of our listeners, your listeners, Jason, were not privy to the broadcast last week, as we unpack this deep state financial and political eugenics. And I'm also going to get into the eugenics of debt, including the eugenics of war, which I believe will blow away the minds of your listeners. So I believe Winston Churchill once said, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside of an enigma. And so what we want to do today, Jason, is to take this enigma and to open its origin or its origination in order to expose the mystery so that we can properly unwrap and reveal the riddle. Now, last week, we've been actually talking about, not just last week, but the past 2 weeks, concerning the history or the historicity of eugenics, which means good stock. We know that in 1792, the New York Stock Exchange was created, and then it was located at 68 Wall Street. Now I believe it's at 11 Wall Street and Broad Street. 78 years later, 1870, the New York Cotton Exchange was created and located at 1 Hanover Square. And we talked about August Belmont Schurenberg being a Rothschild agent here in the United States of America. He oversaw both the New York Stock Exchange and the New York Cotton Exchange. I want to make that clear. So 1 Hanover Square, we talked about the Masonic wordology of compass and square, all right, including the New York Board of Trade, which is the parent company of both the New York Cotton Exchange, including the Coffee, Sugar, and Cocoa Exchange back in 1882. So then the New York Stock Exchange,
Bishop,
the
forgive
stock.
me. Could you just remind us what that compass in square imagery was about? That is escaping my memory at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. When we examine the origins of the Masonic order, whether it is the Scottish Rite Masonic order or this global Illuminati Scottish Rite order, it simply means that the compass in the square, which is the insignia of the logo of the Masonic order, of the Masonic Scottish Rite order, Hiram Abiff, it represents order, and that also it represents darkness. And I believe that we touched on the schematics of the city in the domain of Washington, D.C. So when we see words like square or the words like compass, those are Masonic terminologies, Jason, to our listeners, that the founding fathers put in, and every founding father was a 33rd degree Mason.
Wow.
There is a phrase that we often use in America: why are you giving me the third degree? Well, on the third degree in the Masonic order, when we're going from 1 to 33 degrees, the third degree is a system in a Masonic order where one has to actually get into a coffin. All right, we're going to touch on that because that coffin is connected to the pictures that you're going to show us that you took of African burial ground. It's going to be very powerful there.
Wow.
But also the New York Stock Exchange is now owned by a company by the name of the Intercontinental Exchange, or ICE, where Jeffrey C. Sprecher is the CEO. Now, quickly here, as we continue to talk about the Deep State Financial and Political Eugenics Part 2, we know that 24 stockbrokers met in Wall Street, and which thereby created the New York Stock Exchange. And this event on the 17th of May in 1792, Jason, was called the Buttonwood Agreement. Again, the Buttonwood Agreement, because they met under a buttonwood tree. And then 78 years later, in 1870, the New York Cotton Exchange. So the stock that the global elite sold from the beginning was not stock from IBM and Frito-Lay or Coca-Cola,
right,
or Berkshire Hathaway, but the stock, Jason, was indigenous African slaves, all right? And the cotton was the product that the indigenous African slaves produced. Up until the Civil War, the South dominated the cotton trade, not only here in the United States, but throughout the world, where Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers controlled 85% of the cotton trade. And that's very interesting. So as we move forward quickly, in 1760, and this is something that I didn't say last week, but just quickly here, I'm kind of laying the foundation from last week, just in case those your listeners were not privy to last week's teaching. But it's interesting, Jason, that in 1760, Mayor Amschel Bauer, capital Bauer, had changed his name from Bauer to Rothschild or Rothschild. Why?
Oh, wow.
Because he was in a political and religious connection to the Vatican. That's another topic for another day. So in 1760, Jason, the Rothschild dynasty had changed their name specifically from Bauer to Rothschild or Rothschild, which means red shield. Now, the insignia on the Rothschild shield is a hexagram, or a six-pointed star, all right, which is actually not the Star of David, but also it represents the star of what we call Baphomet, who is the Illuminati god, part man and part goat or beast. Interesting, the logo of the Democratic Party. So as we go further into the deep state financial and political eugenics here, Wall Street is specifically named because beginning in 1664, the first slaves coming to New York City, which was called New Amsterdam, and back in 1609, Jason, the Rothschild dynasty created the first central bank throughout the world called the Bank of Amsterdam, all right? And because of that, in 1664, with Rothschild money, the British had changed the name from New Amsterdam to New York, which is New York City, New York State today. So we have this name, New York State, because of the Rothschild money being funneled through the first central bank in history in 1609 the Bank of Amsterdam, which was created with Rothschild money. Now, Wall Street, from the Hudson River down to the East River, indigenous African slaves built a physical wall of 9 feet high, but also, Jason, and to our listeners, Wall Street also represents the wall of slaves, of the indigenous African slaves, of men, women, and babies that were sold to who? To some of the most powerful banking houses in the United States of America. And so some of these banking houses, J.P. Morgan, we talked about the Aetna Insurance Company, New York Life. And so in about 5 minutes, I'm going to expose to our audience, as we laid the foundation of the deep state financial and political eugenics here on Crowdsource the Truth. So then Wall Street, up until the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and 2 years later, by the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, sold and lent out or borrowed out slaves, indigenous African slaves. So then the American temp staffing service, Jason, is accredited to the slave trade, because a lot of slave owners who were of the left, liberal, democratic slave owners, would not only sell slaves to other plantations, but Jason, they would also lent out through a temporary basis of slaves. And this is the reason why we have what we call the American Staffing Temp Service today.
Wow.
So a company would pay a slave owner, but the slave owner would not give the slave a dime. So in this deep state financial and political eugenics part 2, and we touched on that 20,000 slaves are buried beneath the ground of Wall Street. And then, Jason, if you can, when you get an opportunity, show those pictures that you took of the burial ground there in Wall Street. And we're going to point this out here. Now, in these pictures, one of the pictures shows a skeleton structure of a body buried in a 6-pointed coffin. Again, a skeletal structure built inside of a 6-pointed coffin. Now, within the Masonic order, Jason, that represents either a high-ranking Mason buried the slave, or that skeleton engraving is that of a slave master himself. So a 6-pointed side or schematic or structure of a coffin, that Masonically, that represents a Masonic order burial. And so when you sent these to me the other day, I was fascinated and I was blown away.
Yeah. Bishop, I think we should tell everyone that these are pictures that I've taken just the other day. This is what's down there at the courthouse right now. This is not something we've downloaded from the internet. This is not some strange thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So these photos that your listeners are viewing right now, and so fascinating, when you look at the 6-pointed crypt or coffin, and to young people it's very interesting that the Persian term for blood is Abel. In the Persian term for crypt is crypt or coffin. And this is where we get the term bloods and crypts.
Whoa.
Another topic for today. We talked about necro in Latin, black, necro or necrophiliac in Greek means the autopsy of a dead body. So this insignia here, the African burial ground, 1712 to 1794, it shows in a creepy way a skeleton laying in a 6-pointed Masonic coffin. Why is that? That is not by accident. They could not engrave as a African slave, but it was not just a skeleton. But when we examine the skeleton, it's got multiple broken bones.
Yes.
Representing the broken psychology of not Black America, but those who think that they are a victim. And so the wordage on this engraving talks about, I'm going to rise again. All right. I'm a slave, or I'm rising from my slave ancestors. It's always pointing to victimization. And I'm so happy, again, Jason, that you took these pictures. Again, so when we examine the six-pointed coffin, it simply represents either a high-ranking Mason who was a slave owner, buried this slave, or it also may represent the death of a high-ranking Masonic slave owner. All right, so it is not by accident that this coffin has 6 points to it, Masonically.
May I ask you some questions about this image? Because I was quite intrigued by it when I saw it, and I didn't really have time to study it, so I wanted to make sure to take as many extremely high-resolution photographs as I could so that we could study it, maybe even over the course of several shows. But one of the things that jumped out at me right away was the symbology around this circle. I'm going to go to a few more images I have of it because there's quite a few images that I took. But these symbols, they strike me as being reminiscent of hieroglyphics or even symbols that are on the Led Zeppelin albums, Led Zeppelin 4. I know maybe that's a stupid reference, but what do you think, or do you know the significance of these symbols around the outer edge? It's almost like a sigil.
Those symbols, or the symbologies, those symbols around the edge of this engraving represents the trade or the type of religion that the slave had to submit to, whether it is a animal, whether it is a religious engraving. We're talking about the religiosity of the slaves, whether it is a fish, whether it is a circle or some type of a symbol. Those symbols specifically represent the life of the slave that the slave had to submit to in order to build this deep state financial and political eugenics. And again, I'm so happy, Jason, that you're showing this, because when we go into detail, again, these symbols around this 6-pointed Masonic coffin, and by the way, that coffin is called a Masonic Master Mason coffin, all right? Again, a Masonic Master Mason coffin, and you can definitely go to a traveling Freemason blogspot.com, a traveling Freemason.blogspot.com. So in other words, the engraving of this skeleton, also it can point to a secret society. And so also I want to point out, Jason, something just came to my mind, that many of the slave owners during the 465 years of slavery throughout the world, from 1400 to 1865, through the passage of the 13th Amendment, many slave owners, including in history, when you study Chinese history of slavery, many slave owners, when they died, they forced some of their slaves to be buried alive with them. Right. That is sick.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
So that they can serve them in the afterlife, I think was the belief?
Yes. Yes. There you go. So that they could serve them in the afterlife. So the slave was to be buried alive so that the energy of the slave could transfer to the slave master's corpse.
Whoa.
This is what we're looking at here. This 6-pointed Masonic Mason master coffin, what we call Masonic master mason coffin. So many slaves in the South, they had some of their favorite slaves to be buried with them. One notable slave owner by the name of Moses Taylor, who was the creator and the founder of Citibank.
Oh.
Moses Taylor, upon his death, had a lot of female slaves buried alive with him. We're talking about the CEO or the founder of Citibank.
Wow.
So when we're talking about the Deep State Financial and Political Eugenics Part 2, this symbol here, it is a six-pointed symbol representing the Masonic order. It represents a Masonic master mason coffin with multiple broken bones, but also many of the slaves were buried alive with their slave master. Wow. So as you said, Jason, so the slave can be with their master in the afterlife, because many of the slave masters, including just like the Nazis during the Third Reich, were practitioners of what we call pharmakia, or witchcraft. And we're talking about the Deep State Financial and Political Eugenics. Many of these slave masters throughout American history, from specifically 1619 to 1865, because the first slaves that came to America came to the port of Comfort off of the peninsula of Virginia in 1619. Many of those slaves were buried alive, either on top of the slave master or on the bottom. In other words, they're going to transfer life from the slave to the master in the afterlife. And those symbols represent the residue of the life of the slave that was buried.
And Bishop, as you're explaining, sorry to interrupt, but as you're explaining this to us, it also occurs to me that what you're describing could be a method that the slave masters might use to ensure that the slaves don't murder them, because they would know that there'd be a whole cadre of people to make sure that a bunch of the slaves would then be buried alive with the master. There's one other thing that jumps out at me as you're talking about this image and we're looking at it. I've noticed, and this is another reason why I'm also glad I've taken these high-resolution images, I've noticed that there's a bunch of rocks around the coffin, and this, which looks like a padlock right here, which almost seems like a chain and a lock around the coffin.
Yes. Notice that, and I'm glad, Jason, you are so detailed, just like myself. When you look at the padlock, it also represents, even in death, the slave is still a slave. That he or she, an adult, adolescent, or child, is still interlocked into the slave system, even 6 feet down. There's a saying in the African American community, and it goes like this: better to be judged by 12 than to be carried by 6. So when we look at the 6-pointed coffin, and specifically the padlock, so then whoever created this engraving, they knew what they were doing. And you notice the sundial around the symbols here. So it represents the afterlife. Padlocks, or multiple padlocks, which means the slave, through the Deep State Financial and Political Eugenics, will always be a slave in the afterlife. This is sick. This is a Willie Lynch demonic psychosis. And to all of our listeners, please look at this, share this, this powerful interview, because what the Masonic order does, Jason, they're big in symbols. And we talked about the compass in the square, all right? We talked about the phrase, the third degree, all right? And in this 33 degrees. And you talked about a couple of weeks ago about these addresses of 333, right? Around the United States. Nothing's by accident. And so a lot of these slave owners, who contributed to the transatlantic slave trade. I have to say, not just Moses Taylor, the founder of Citibank, had slaves buried with him, but it's more interesting also, Jason, that many of the slave owners who were connected to J.P. Morgan, Wachovia Bank, Norfolk Southern, CSX Railroad, Brown Brothers Harriman, and even Brooke Brothers, who provided the clothing for the slaves.
Wow.
Brooke Brothers, one of the most leading men's fashion companies in this country, provided the clothing for the slaves. Brooke Brothers,
Wow.
Barclays, N&M Rothschild. So when you look at this sundial here, it's very interesting. And you and I touched on this last week concerning Aetna, Dead Peasants Insurance. New York Life Insurance had sold 508 policies covering slaves. And many of the slave owners, Jason, that's a powerful image that you're showing. Many of the slave owners would put up slaves as collateral to borrow more money from the House of Rothschilds, J.P. Morgan, Wachovia Bank, Wells Fargo. All right. Now, even Bank of America, if the slave owner defaulted on the loan, guess who got the slaves? The bank. So the slave was not considered a human being. A slave was considered a commodity.
Wow. Yeah.
Something that can be bought and sold at the behest of the slave master. I'm going to say this too, Jason, and that's a powerful image, again, that you're showing here. Because this image that has a padlock, and I cannot say this enough to our listeners, when we're delving deeper into this eugenics, there's different types of eugenics, and we're going to be getting to the eugenics of debt in war. This padlock that you showed, Jason, in the sundial, the sun represents the energy of slavery that would continue with the slave in the afterlife. That's critical. Moses Taylor, founder of Citibank, had a lot of female slaves buried with him.
Now, Bishop, I'm sorry to interrupt because I know you have a lot to lay out, and we've got a little bit of a delay, so I need to jump in when I want your attention. And there's a lot of questions coming to us in the comments, so I just want to give people a little background. So what we're looking at here on the Google Earth map, this is a square right in front of the federal courts downtown in New York, which, to answer a question from Periscope, yes, this is very close to Wall Street. And I think that people also need to keep in mind that the map that we're looking at right now is current. This is from within, I would say, certainly 2 years. So when we see something like this sundial, you know, this is what's down there outside the courthouse right now. But it's interesting to note, Bishop, that there's a lot of sort of points of the star shooting out from this thing. I noticed that, you know, we've got another little sort of mini star shooting out over here. And then that's got a darker line. There are some light lines and some dark lines. But these roads that are intersecting the star points are perhaps newer than the sundial itself. And this dark line here that I'm now zooming in on, this is what leads to the area where I've photographed the sigil. You can see it through the trees here. We don't have a lot of detail in the Google Earth photo, but this star is where I was standing when I took the photos of the slave burial ground. It's interestingly located underneath this tree right outside the federal building. The FBI and everything is inside this federal building right here. And when I took these photos, Bishop, it was interesting because there was a guy standing there who, he wasn't a cop really. He was, I guess he was like a park ranger. He was some sort of city employee who was clearly assigned to this spot. And he was a black man. And I asked him a couple questions about this. He didn't really know anything about the history of it. And he just sort of giggled uncomfortably when I said, it's pretty weird, isn't it? So he didn't seem to know much about it, but I think it's just very visceral and sort of off-putting.
It is. And you know what, Jason? Again, I'm so glad that you're showing this, and thank you for that information. I've been on a lot of radio shows for the past 25 years, and I've been the host of Global Spiritual Revolution Radio for the past 25 years. And your show, Jason, you have the most astute listeners I have ever been a part of. They're so astute and detailed, and we thank God for that. But you know what? If you can go back to that symbol again, Jason.
Sure.
I just saw something here. You got 10 spaces around this coffin, all right? And you got 10 spaces. It's in marble, right? Copper marble, brownish. So it's 10 spaces. Again, what I'm about to say, it cannot be substantiated, but as I'm looking at it from a spiritual dimension, it could represent the schematic of a man or woman, right? The 10 fingers, 10 toes, and the Jewish historian Maimonides said that the universe was created in 10 dimensions. Unai means unity, verse means the scriptures. So universe means the unity of the scriptures. So when I see this 10-pointed ray, it could also represent that at the death of both the slave master, 6-pointed coffin, a high-ranking Mason, with his or her slaves, because they were female slaves as well. Not only would they take the slave to the afterlife, but these 10-pointed universal powers of being or energy can go with him. So the like I said a couple of minutes ago, just like in the Third Reich, all right, the Allies, when they won the war in 1945 over Nazi Germany, in Himmler's house, they found over 66,000 books on the occult. Wow. All right, in Himmler's house.
It's a lot.
Yes, sir. Just like in the slave trade, many of these slave masters were high-ranking occultists. This is crazy here. So, and Jason, if you can go to. Something came to my mind. Go to and type in the Treasury's tweet shows slavery is still misunderstood. Let me say that again. The Treasury's tweet shows slavery is still misunderstood. That's a February 12, 2008 article in the Guardian newspaper, theguardian.com. Again, theguardian.com. And to your listeners also, for their studies, they can also go to another article that the Guardian newspaper printed and wrote back in 2018, I believe in March the 29th, 2018, on when will Britain face up to its crimes against humanity, all right? So in other words, as we look at the deep state political and financial eugenics, deep state financial and political eugenics. Back in 1833, okay, there was a law that was passed in Great Britain. See, Great Britain abolished slavery in 1833, okay? So this law was called the Abolition Act of 1833. Again, the Abolition Act of 1833, and we're still talking about the deep state financial and political eugenics. Jason, at the end of slavery in Great Britain in 1833, the British government borrowed millions of dollars from the Rothschild Bank, okay? So they borrowed 20 million pounds sterling, which is over $26 million in U.S. currency.
Wow.
That was 40% of the national budget of Great in 1833.
Yeah, that's a huge sum.
Yeah. Yes. So then that amount was borrowed to fulfill the 1833 Abolition Act for what? To pay the generations of the slaves. And mind you, I don't believe in reparations. I'm a black conservative. I'm a Black Republican. I don't believe in victimhood. I'm not a victim. But Jason, so then 20 million sterling pounds in British dollars, right? Which is transliterated into over $26 million in US dollars. For what? To pay the 46,000 slave owners around the world and their generations. And that debt, Jason, which started in 1833, was not completed until 4 years ago.
Whoa.
2015. So wait a minute now. So the British government actually the British citizens did not know that they were paying taxes toward ending slavery in Great Britain, but they were not told, Jason, that the monies were going to the 46,000 slave owners throughout the empire that would go also to their generations in perpetual pituitude throughout history. In other words, it took
perpetuity.
Britain, perpetuity. Yes, it took them 182 years. My God, it took Britain 182 years to pay. In other words, if we calculate this in U.S. dollars, what they borrowed from the Rothschilds would be over $25,968,125, which didn't go to the families of the descendants of the slaves. It went to the slave owners. But the British people, Jason, were paying taxes toward the generations of those who had enslaved humanity. I cannot help but to think this is powerful here.
Yeah.
And so Nathan Mayer Rothschild, quickly here as we go on here, and his brother-in-law, Moses Montefiore, loaned the British government specifically 15 pounds sterling, 15 pounds sterling dollars, which is $19,475,100 in our currency, according to what the pound is showing today on their stock market. Mm-hmm. With the British government adding an additional 5 million pounds sterling dollars later, which is around over $6 million of our currency. Jason, that is the modern equivalent today of over $22 billion that was paid out by the British government to former slave owners, 46,000 of them for the past 182 years. This is powerful here. So this is the deep state financial and political eugenics.
Yeah.
So then as we move here quickly here, and Jason, if you got any questions or anything that pops in your mind, interrupt me, because, I'm like a machine here. So then...
No, it's fascinating, Bishop. I think that most people, definitely myself included, had no idea of, the influence that slavery had on the world economy.
Oh, my God. It did. Because when you look at what Great Britain did in paying the millions, actually billions of dollars in today's dollars, was to pay the owners, the slave owners throughout the empire of Great Britain, including their generations and their posterity, in order to free the slaves. In other words, slaves technically were not free until 2015.
Why 2015? Because that's when the debt was paid.
That was the specific date that the debt was paid.
Huh.
So in this deep state, so also that this is exposing the deep state of the British Empire, as we're talking about the deep state financial and political eugenics part 2.
Right.
Now I want to get into the financial eugenics of war here. All right, and we'll probably go over just 10 minutes. But the financial eugenics of war. Now, Jason, one of my favorite sayings, all right, and I don't like this person. I don't like to quote this person because he was a communist and a killer. But Mao Zedong once said that history is a symptom of our disease, and that war is the symptom of our sickness. War is the symptom of our sickness. To our listeners, there was a French-born Frenchman, a Swiss-born Frenchman, who wrote a manifesto in 1861 entitled "The Comprehension of War in History." Again, "The Comprehension of War in History" by Dr. Gustav Valbert. All right, capital Valbert. Now, it's very interesting, Jason. He wrote in 1861. We're still talking about the deep state, financial and political eugenics, part 2, specifically on the eugenics of war. So in 1861, Dr. Gustav Valbert wrote that from 1496 BC to 1861 AD, which is a period of 3,358 years, only 227 of those years were years of peace, Jason. In other words, between 1496 BC to 1861 AD, a period of 3,358 years, only 227 years of that time period were years of peace, where the balance of 3,130 years were years of war. In other words, Jason, peace comes every 13 years. In other words, 13 years of war to every year of peace.
Whoa.
Think about it. 13 years of war to every year of peace. So from 1550 to 1850, and we're talking about the deep state financial and political eugenics, part 2 here today, specifically the
Bishop?
86 wars in Europe from 1550 to 1850. Now, from 1500 BC to 1860 AD, get this, Jason, there was more than 8,000 peace treaties. Only 2.4% of those treaties were ever enacted. In other words, you got 3,100 years of recorded history. This is when Dr. Gustav Valbert wrote this in 1861. That the world has only been at peace for only 8% of the time.
Wow.
This is mind-boggling. So we're talking about the deep state financial and political eugenics part 2, the eugenics of war, according to the Canadian Army Journal. All right. You can go to newsletter.co.uk, or just write in, and this is a very powerful article here I want to share with you guys. Wars have made our world a thorny, Thorny, a thorny place. Wars have made our world a thorny place. So in other words, as we're talking about the eugenics of war, according to the Canadian Army Journal, wars have made our world a thorny place. Since 3,600 BC, the world has only known, Jason, 292 years of peace. Think about that. Since 3,600 BC, the globe, the world, humanity has only known 292 years of peace. 100 million people were killed in the 20th century alone.
Wow.
And you know, Jason, before World War I, there was not a universal global war that was on that scale. There were continental wars, but there was not a universal or global war. So then the Wall Street bankers, Jacob Schiff, the house of J.P. Morgan, the dynasty of the Rothschilds, they have created wars in history for what? For money.
Yeah.
So as we dissect this, Jason, even further, we're talking about, again, the deep state financial and political eugenics part 2. So we have one piece, we have a year apiece every 13 years. So in other words, according to the Institute of War in Washington, D.C., and they gave an estimate that there was at least 25,000 wars in history. And between 150 million to 1 billion people died in these wars. Between 150 million to 1 billion people have died in these wars. So there was an article, Jason, and we're still talking about the deep state financial and political eugenics part 2, the eugenics of war. And there was an article that was written, all right, a few years ago. And it's very powerful here, and you can find it on this website, and it talks about the United States of America, or the USA, has been at war 222 years out of the 239 years of our existence. I want every one of your listeners to get a hold of that. This is powerful. Now, this was written a few years ago, okay? 222 years out of 239 years of the history, or the historicity of the United States of America. We have been at war for 222 of those years out of 239. In other words, Jason, the United States of America has only been at peace, my friend, for less than 20 years.
I know. Since
1776. So this was back in March 2017. Freakometrics.com, capital FREAKONOMETRICS. So in other words, let's break this down. 222 out of the 239 years since 1776, the United States Empire has been involved in some war 93% of the time.
93.
So 93%, and this is back in 2017. When all your listeners just type in right now, the U.S. has been at war 222 out of 239 years. It says America, according to this statistic, has been at war 93% of the time. And so, in other words, war is big business for the global elite from Wall Street. So when you're talking about Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, AIG, Aetna, New York Life Insurance, the Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Wachovia Bank, Jacob Schiff, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, who gave $20 million to Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky for the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. War creates billions of dollars. That's war. So then why is the psychology of the world not at peace? We're talking about the deep state financial and political eugenics part 2. That is the eugenics of war. Now let's get into, as we close out here today, the eugenics of debt. I want your listeners to go to the link sovereignman.com. Sovereign, capital SOVREIGNMAN.com, sovereignman.com, or just definitely type in the eugenics of death, or the bad business, the big bad business of America's war history. That's interesting. So it talks about the eugenics of debt. Now, Jason, back in October 22nd, 2014, the national debt for the United States of America was $17.9 trillion, okay? And that this article was back in 2014, October 22nd, 2014. And so what the article is writing about specifically concerning the eugenics of death, that back in 2014, the United States national debt was $17.9 trillion. Okay. Now, when we examine that $17.9 trillion, okay, it would take us, Jason, over 398,879,561 years to pay off. Again, this is the deep state financial and political eugenics, the eugenics of debt. So this is back in 2014, 5 years ago. Wait a minute now. So it's going to take us over 398 million years to pay off at $17.9 trillion dollar debt. Now, I believe the national debt is up to 22 trillion. Now, let's talk about even further here, the global debt. Now, it's interesting that CNBC has written a very interesting article, and I really don't like the corporation because they're liberal, but from a deep state financial and political eugenics standpoint, type in global debt surged to a record 250 trillion. Global debt surged to a record 250 trillion. That's on the CNBC markets, all right, CNBC. Now, that's back during the first half of the quarter of this year, June of 2019. If it's going to take 398 million years to pay off a $17.9 trillion debt, it's going to take, Jason, approximately 3.6 billion years to pay off this global $250 trillion debt.
I mean, that's obviously undoable.
It's undoable because the global system, as we're talking about the deep state financial and political eugenics, the global system, and 35 to 40% of the global system depends on the drug trade. That's another topic for another day.
Oh, yeah.
The eugenics of the drug trade. We're talking about the Golden Triangle, Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar. Now Afghanistan controls 90 to 95% of the world's poppy. That's why no president can get out of Afghanistan. Because if Trump tries to do it, they're killing. Because 40%, Jason, of the GDP of the earth, of the planet, of all 191 nations, depends on the legal or the illegal drug trade.
Wow.
That's
40%.
powerful. So we're talking about, yes, whether it's legal through the pharmaceutical companies around the world or illegal drug trade. When you combine legal and illegal drug trades, or going through either the pharmaceutical companies through a legal way or through the illegal drug trafficking throughout the world, specifically in Afghanistan. It is billions of dollars. So then, this is the deep state financial and political eugenics, how the global elite has schematically created this paradigm. So this paradigm, you talk about the, going back to the eugenics of war. World War I cost us $334 billion. World War II, $4 trillion.
I'm surprised it wasn't 333. And Bishop, we've got a question coming from A&R Farms. Who is this money owed to?
I am so happy. Thank you to that. That brings me to my next statement. And I want to thank your listener for even asking that question, because this is very important. The Rothschild dynasty, now think about this, the global debt as of June of this year, all right, was $250 trillion. The Rothschild dynasty. There's a book called The Money Masters. Again, there's a book called The Money Masters. And the Ohio State University put out a very interesting article on the Rothschild dynasty, okay? Very interesting. The family of the Rothschild dynasty controls 80% of the world's wealth as far as central banking, real estate, education, trade, commerce. Jason, 80%. And they're worth $500 trillion. But the world's debt is $250 trillion. So they answered the question from your very astute listener, who owns that debt? The Rothschilds. They own that debt. All right. So you're telling me one family controls 80% of the world's wealth and controls 75% of the central banks around the world, and there's not a check on them, and they control the Federal Reserve of the United States. Jason, this is a deep state financial and political eugenics. You know who owns the Federal Reserve in this country?
The banks.
Non-U.S. citizens. Yes. There are 13, and this is another topic for another day. We're talking about the 13 bloodlines of the Illuminati. They control the Federal Reserve of the United States, and there's not one American citizen. So this is a beast, this thing. And so this $250 trillion debt is controlled by the Rothschilds. Can I share this with you, my friend?
Please.
When we talk about the deep state financial and political eugenics part 2, the eugenics of debt. Now, banks, when we're talking about private central banking, all of your listeners, they should write this down. This is very important. Banks, when we're talking about global private central banking, is not about making money or profits, Jason. The goal of the global elite through private central banking is not even to control the weapons that many of the second and third world nations like China and Saudi Arabia and even England, who is the first world country, they're funneling billions of dollars through not just the drug trade, through banks, through the Rothschild banks, but also the sale of weapons in the black market. So they're not interested in making money. I know that sounds paradoxical. In other words, it's about control.
Bishop, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a very strange thing that's just occurred. I have no control over the computer, so you and I can still continue, but I don't think I'm going to be able to bring up any more graphics or anything. It's totally frozen out.
That's okay. I think the deep state is very scared and they're very concerned.
I can't control anything.
Absolutely. So to your listeners, Jason, as we talk about the deep state financial and political eugenics part 2, the eugenics, we're talking about all the way back to 1883 to Dr. Francis Galton, all the way up to the 1600s to the transatlantic slave trade in the United States via Wall Street. Now we're talking about the eugenics of not just war, the eugenics of debt. Now check this out. The goal of the bankers, to our listeners, is not to make profits or even to control the flow of weapons that they sell. Yes, banks sell weapons by way of the CIA, the NSA, MI5, MI6, KGB, Chinese intelligence. But the goal of the global elite, and I want your listeners to hear me right now, okay, is not to control the conflict. It is to control the debt, Jason, that the conflict produces.
Right. Bishop, I still have you. Bishop? Bishop, can you hear me? I think I've lost. Oh. Well, there it is. Computer totally off. So, Bishop, unfortunately, that seems to be the end of the show. The computer has totally died. That is so weird. Never happened like that before. Bishop Gaiters will be back next week. I apologize to the viewers. We're going to go address this issue. No idea what's happening. Have a great day, everybody. I'll be back at 3 o'clock with Larry Nichols, if I can get everything working. Bishop, I'm so sorry.